5 women were found dead, all of them with their throats cut, and their intestines drawn over their corpses. These horrendous murders were attributed to the most infamous serial killer of all time, Jack the Ripper. All of Jack's victims were prostitutes that lived in the area, which was not an uncommon profession at the time. Superintendent Thomas, a policeman working on the Ripper case, said about the city.
A considerable portion of the population of Whitechapel is composed of the low and dangerous classes, who frequently indulge in rowdyism and street offenses.
Whitechapel was so filled with crime that policemen rarely dared to enter the area, making it the perfect breeding ground for the Ripper to be born. Over this 10-week rampage of Jack the Ripper, the 5 women that were murdered were all found by other citizens, being left there as a kind of display. The killings exploded in the press, and hundreds of letters were sent to the police in the Ripper's name. And this spectacle of Jack the Ripper was not only contained to the 19th century. Even as recently as 1988, the FBI opened a case on Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was never identified, despite desperate attempts by the London police force, and his case has stayed relevant ever since. So what makes Jack the Ripper so infamous? And why do we see serial killers so frequently in pop culture? We're about to find out. Well, to answer this, I'm going to have to bring in my dedicated serial killer correspondent, Dr. Wartensfinkel.
So what attracts us so much to these serial killers like Jack the Ripper?
Alright, well, how do we answer this question? A large part contributing to the intrigue of the case of Jack the Ripper, and cases similar, is the mystery. The mystery surrounding the case of the Ripper, one instance being that Jack was never identified, adds to the appeal of the story. We as humans naturally want to figure things out, and the holes in investigations, such as Jack's, are filled with countless theories for what could have happened. One such theory is that of Joe Silver being the infamous Ripper. This theory, covered by author Robert Kaplan, provides a convincing argument for the identity of Jack. Joe Silver was a gangster and a human trafficker with a history of verbal abuse and violent threats towards the women he handled, as well as being wanted in 4 different continents by the time of the Ripper murders. In the same exact year, Joe had found himself with a pregnant prostitute paired with a nasty case of syphilis. You don't want that one, Jacob, I'll tell you that. Kaplan theorized that this could have caused a general hatred towards women, and especially prostitutes. His life being threatened by syphilis aligned with his tendency towards violence, and threats of cutting up his prostitutes allows for a solid motive as well as a timeline for the killings of the canonical 5. Shortly after the death of the 5 prostitutes, Joe was found dead with the very same modus operandi of Jack the Ripper. And doctor, what was his modus operandi? With his throat savagely cut open.
There are dozens of theories claiming to have found the identity of Jack the Ripper, some of them with real merit and evidence backing them up. The popularity of these cases keeps circling the public sphere because of the highly speculative nature of cases shrouded in mystery. If there isn't enough evidence, people are eventually going to find something to fill the gaps, creating some interesting story. Cases with a similar pop culture relevance would be the Zodiac Killer and the Long Island Killer. Both have multiple movies, documentaries, and communities around the world dedicated to telling their story, as well as theorizing possible realities surrounding the killers. The story just seems to draw us in, as we can endlessly spew out answers long after the truth has been lost to time. So Dr. Wartensfinkel, what are some other reasons that kind of draw us towards these types of killers? Well, a more obvious reason that we are intrigued by killers, aforementioned, is the emotional shock factor that comes with the brutal tellings of such happenings. We as humans have an innate morbid curiosity that Marissa Harrison defines in her analysis on serial killers' popularity as the mixture of excitement, fear, and compulsion that pushes us to uncover the horror of cases like Jack the Ripper or other true crime documentaries. Look at horror movies. In 2017 alone, the industry grossed $733 million and has been a thriving industry ever since, and long before. This, along with the countless true crime documentaries and TV shows, shows how popular these types of stories are. Even if we look outside of horror, there's a large appeal for mystery-oriented stories. Look at movies like Seven and Prisoners. They're both critically acclaimed, graphic thriller movies that blend following the solving of a mystery with unsettling and shocking imagery, perfectly concocting a movie smoothie for our primal interest in outlandish and thrilling situations. We simply cannot resist unsolving a mystery, uncovering a threat, even if it's not real. In her analysis, Harrison concludes that our instinctive threat detection cannot unconsciously differentiate a real threat with a fictional one, which can explain why in her research she found little difference between watching a horror movie about real events or a completely impossible one.
You know, other than our emotional draw to the cases, our cognitive side also leads us towards the novel of serial killer stories. Russian writer Ekaterina Gulina delves into why young adults consume media surrounding serial killers, speaking on our cognitive drive towards researching these types of media. Here, I have the paper here actually. She concluded that, in quote, cognitive motives could be viewed through the lens of the need for ontological security, an attempt to study a potential threat. And this means that our way of coping with tragedies found in these cases and the possibility of something alike happening to us is by using the stories as a medium of entertainment to reduce the threat of researching it, to prepare for the worst.
This happens unconsciously as a defense mechanism, which leads us to other evolutionary questions about why we're so aware and cautious about the dangers around us, but let's stay on topic. Gulina's conclusion about this drive towards dangerous knowledge and how we use it as a means of entertainment and control over the situation adds to the idea that we consume these violent stories as a method to take control, to make sense of the chaos and unpredictability of our daily lives. You might instinctively think that these violent and undeniably repulsive stories would make them unpopular, but there seems to be this undeniable attraction to serial killer stories in modern media. Jack the Ripper, who brutally dismembered his victims for the public to see, is publicly known as the most infamous serial killer in recent history. Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Richard Ramirez, most people walking down the street would be able to recognize most of these names. The emotional shock factor that these stories carry can explain why these figures are so highly publicized. They're polarizing, extreme, fear-inducing, evil. All things that counterintuitively draw us to them, temporarily relieving our morbid curiosity of the extremes of what humans are capable of, all while our desire for control contributes to our investigative nature of these tragic topics. We gain as much knowledge, as much evidence as we can to make sense of these killers, so as to take back from the shadow of fear cast on us by the tales of the notorious wicked.